In previous episodes, we have examined stories of impossibly oversized creatures whose mere existence appears to defy belief. And this week, we will be looking at perhaps the most horrifying of these alleged beasts, a gigantic species of spider known to those who have survived encounters with it as the lurking horror. Turning to see the fatigue and exhaustion etched upon the faces of the men stumbling along behind him, Remy Jansen shook his head in frustration and signalled for the column to stop and rest up for a while. Watching as his few remaining men moved amongst the survivors, administering carefully rationed food and water, the sergeant was amazed they had managed to survive thus far. The mercenary attack upon the outpost they had been guarding had been short and brutal, with half of his small command perishing in the opening moments, the remainder fleeing alongside the surviving missionaries. On some level, he could not resent those who had attacked him and his men. They were simply carrying out their duty, themselves in the employ of the local slave trading gangs, whilst his pay instead came from the far-removed Belgian government. It had been his idea for them to head north into the jungle, away from any other settled areas, in the hope that the relative isolation would discourage their attackers from pursuing them. But now they had become hopelessly lost, roaming aimlessly through a maze of impenetrable vegetation, their supplies dwindling with each passing day. An unexpected commotion roused Jansen from his thoughts. His hand reached down instinctively for his rifle before he hurried towards the rear of the column. When he arrived, he found one of his men slowly backing towards him, the soldier's weapon pointing nervously towards the surrounding undergrowth. In fearful and hushed tones, the man informed him that something had come creeping out from the trees, before then seizing hold of and abducting one of the surviving missionaries. Almost immediately, a panicked cry sounded this time from the front of the column, followed moments later by another. Within seconds, the terrified men were running this way and that, screaming aloud in horror. As Jansen watched on, dark shapes came scuttling out of the darkness around them, colliding with and knocking the fleeing men to the ground before dragging them back into the shadows. Suddenly, something erupted from the tree line a short distance away, rushing towards him at an impossibly fast pace. The NCO's life was spared only by the reflexive speed with which he was able to raise his rifle and open fire. Both he and the soldier next to him looked down at the twitching carcass that came to rest at his feet, a thick mass of hair covering 8 giant legs which extended out from a distended body. As the brush around them now came to life with a deafening chorus of rustling and hissing, the 2 soldiers immediately turned and ran back in the direction they came from, trying to ignore the screams of the men being dragged away, and the vision of the horrifying creatures which would be responsible for their deaths. During our Enemy Unexplained video, we related a number of stories in which soldiers reported encountering horrifyingly oversized creatures within the forests of Vietnam. One such tale made reference to a similar incident which had historically taken place in the Belgian Congo, where a gigantic python had been photographed by a pilot flying low over a remote part of the territory. But it appears that it is not only the snakes of this mysterious region which have been known to grow to a terrifying size, with persistent stories of a reclusive species of giant spider also residing there. In November of 2000, notable cryptozoologist William Gibbons had been travelling across the Congo basin looking for evidence of a famed dinosaur-like entity known as Mokele-Mbembe. Whilst on his travels, he and a companion had stopped at a village to speak with the occupants, asking if they had ever encountered the legendary cryptid which he was hunting. It soon became apparent that they had not, but the leader of the tribe, a man named Timbo, did relate the existence of a giant species of spider. The chieftain had related that these dangerous creatures were known to grow to such a size that their leg span came close to a staggering 5 feet in width. Their limbs and upper body were said to be dark brown in colour, making them difficult to see. Only the fact that their abdomen tended to be a distinctive shade of purple meant that tribe members were able to pick them out amongst their surroundings. Villagers would sometimes encounter shelters which had been constructed by the reclusive creatures, where leaves had been woven together with spider silk into a structure comparable in size to a tribal hut. On other occasions, the remains of an antelope or other large animal would be found lying near paths and trails, still held fast amidst the silken trap which had been strung to capture them. It was explained that the children of the Baka tribe were taught from a young age to keep a safe distance from these creatures, due to the potent venom carried in their fangs. Their elders would warn the youngsters to keep a watchful eye out for distinctive clusters of yellowy skinned eggs, hidden away deep in the forest. As Gibbons then proceeded to move through the basin during the course of his expedition, he began to question members of other tribes about the alleged existence of these enigmatic arachnids. And it was during the course of these conversations that he learned the name which had been given to the species by the native people of the region, the J'ba Fofi. Upon returning from his expedition, Gibbons resolved to conduct wider research into the purported existence of the J'ba Fofi, and in doing so, discovered that a number of alleged encounters had already been published. One such incident had been recorded by fellow cryptozoologist George Eberhardt in the pages of his 2002 encyclopedia, Mysterious Creatures, A Guide to Cryptozoology. The chapter in question made reference to the account of an Englishman named Reginald Lloyd, who had been travelling through the Congo with his wife in 1938. During one stage of the couple's journey, they had been driving along a track which bordered a particularly dense area of forest, when something had darted out unexpectedly, right in front of their car. Slamming his foot hard on the brakes, Lloyd had then peered out through the windscreen, expecting to see a monkey staring back at them. But after wiping the dry dust away from the glass in an effort to identify the culprit, he had suddenly recoiled in horror. The offender was not a primate, but instead a giant brown-coloured spider, with a leg span which the Englishman would later estimate to be roughly 3 feet wide. After a few seconds, this creature had suddenly reared up in an aggressive display towards the stationary vehicle, causing Lloyd to take his foot off the brake and drive away in the opposite direction as fast as he could. This encounter had proven so troubling for the couple that upon reaching their next destination, they decided to cut short their trip and catch the next available ship home to England. But by far the most horrifying encounter alleged to have taken place between human beings and the J'ba Fofi is said to have occurred in Uganda during the late 1890s. The newly established British authorities received word that one of their citizens had passed away in a small village, located not far from the shores of Lake Nyasa. A detachment of soldiers was duly dispatched to investigate this report, later finding a simple grave located at the settlement, along with personal possessions which identified the man lying within as Arthur John Sims. Under questioning from the patrol, it was related by villagers that Sims had been a missionary who had briefly stopped off at their village during his wider journey through the region. But several days after Sims and the two porters travelling with him had left to continue their journey, the holy man had suddenly staggered back into the village on his own, rambling incoherently. As his condition gradually deteriorated during the following days, the Englishman explained that he and his companions had been making their way through a particularly dense area of forest. But as they had done so, the trio had become ensnared in some form of web-like structure, which they had blundered into. Whilst in the process of trying to cut themselves free from the strands, the men had suddenly been attacked by two giant spiders, which had apparently been lying in wait nearby. Sims had told the villagers that he believed the creatures were a mating pair, with the larger female measuring roughly 4 feet wide, and the accompanying male roughly half that size. During the attack, the two arachnids had repeatedly bitten their prey. The sharp pincers they possessed apparently injected some form of toxin, which had instantly begun to dull the senses of the struggling men. Firing his pistol repeatedly at their attackers, Sims had managed to successfully free himself, but had then gone on to flee the scene when it became clear that the two porters were beyond saving. Despite repeated efforts, the tribespeople treating Sims had been unable to reverse the effects of the deadly poison flowing through his veins, and a day later, he had sadly passed away. This incident would go on to generate strict guidance for the occupying British troops not to venture too far into the forest, and to heed any warnings offered to them by the native population. In addition to stories of giant spider attacks having taken place within the Congo, near-identical reports have also been received from numerous other locations across the globe. It is alleged that during World War II, an Australian soldier serving in Papua New Guinea encountered a creature similar to the J'ba Fofi. He was part of a patrol responsible for ensuring that Japanese soldiers, in the process of being besieged in one of their encampments, did not manage to break out into the surrounding forests. Having briefly stepped away from the rest of his unit in order to relieve himself, the hapless infantryman had suddenly found himself standing face to face with an enormous spider's web. He would later describe this material as having a slightly fluorescent green hue to it, and being roughly 10 feet in width. A particularly hairy spider was sat regarding him from the base of this structure, similar in size to a large dog, such as a German Shepherd. Utterly terrified that he was about to be attacked, the lone Australian soldier had produced his machete and hacked away at the massive arachnid, before fleeing back to his unit. 20 years later, a similar story would emerge from the battlefields of Vietnam, where a patrol of 5 US servicemen reported having been attacked. The Americans had been slowly and stealthily making their way through the jungle, keeping a watchful eye out for any possible enemy activity. A rustling in some nearby bushes had quickly sent the patrol into a prone position, in preparation of carrying out an ambush on whoever was moving towards them. But as they had laid down with their weapons levelled, they had been amazed to instead see several large spiders come rushing out of the foliage towards them. These creatures were described as being between 2 and 3 feet in width, with a bewildering speed and dexterity to their movements. The patrol had immediately opened fire, tearing the onrushing spiders to pieces before they had turned and beat a hasty retreat. Despite the significant amount of anecdotal evidence pertaining to the recorded encounters with the J'ba Fofi, members of the scientific community remain somewhat skeptical of their existence. Several fossils have been uncovered around the world purporting to be oversized prehistoric spiders, only later found to be either hoaxes or other creatures whose outlines have degraded to give a false representation. The largest living arachnid species encountered by explorers are the huntsman and Goliath tarantula, both of which have been known to grow up to 30 centimeters in width. This is markedly smaller than the creatures described by these witnesses, and zoologists believe that it is the internal makeup of arachnids that prevent them from growing to a greater size than those discovered thus far. One reason is that all species of spider possess a very delicate set of respiratory organs, either consisting of a series of small tubes or air pockets, otherwise known as buck lungs. These are very inefficient, even for spiders of a small size. It is theorized that such structures would cease to function if they were much larger, which is why a giant species of spider has never been scientifically catalogued. Another issue is that the spider's exoskeleton is very heavy, taking a great deal of effort for the creature itself to move around. As with their lungs, scaling this up would prevent the creatures from being able to move with any speed, and they certainly wouldn't be able to stick to their webs or traverse vertical surfaces. That said, it is entirely possible that the spiders encountered by witnesses may not actually be spiders at all, at least not as modern science would classify them. One commonality to the reports received from Africa and Vietnam is that these creatures have always been encountered in close proximity to a water source. This raises the possibility that they may instead be some form of crustacean, such as the tropical coconut crab, which can grow up to 12 feet in width. Although such a huge creature with a thick exoskeleton would be unable to support itself on land, this may not be true of smaller specimens. But if this were the case, how do we explain the webs and venomous toxins reported by witnesses? There are also many depictions of giant spider-like creatures throughout Japanese history, known as the Tsuchigumo, which again allegedly lived in or near to water. Drawings of these mythical demons bear a striking similarity to tarantulas, despite this particular species of spider having never been found to reside within Japanese territory. This again suggests that whatever creature such legends were based upon may have been a large crustacean, as opposed to a giant arachnid. There remains huge swaths and tracts of the Congo which are still unexplored, meaning that the truth behind the stories of the J'ba Fofi cannot be fully ascertained. It may well be at some point in the near future, forensic or surveillance evidence may be produced which conclusively confirms the existence of this horrifying cryptid, and this raises a concerning question. If there are giant snakes and spiders hidden away in the African jungles waiting to be found, then what else may be lurking there alongside them?